II and the present day challenges that Europe is facing, including the war between Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, we're about to now bring you a special report from CBS News in just a few moments.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Gayle King here in New York. We're going to take you to Normandy, France this morning, where President Biden is about to speak at one of the most sacred sites connected to D-Day. It's called Pointe du Hoc, located between Utah and Omaha beaches, where tens of thousands of American troops landed 80 years ago this week. A battalion of Army Rangers scaled 100-foot cliffs at this place under withering fire from the German army to gain an important foothold, allowing the invasion of France to succeed. Think about the visuals of that. President Biden will pay tribute to these men in his speech, following the footsteps of President Ronald Reagan, who spoke memorably in the exact same place 40 years ago. Senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe is in Normandy. He's traveling with the president. Ed, it's good to see you. You know, I was looking at the Reagan speech, and it's brought to my attention that 40 years ago, some of the Rangers were still there. Of course, as we sit here 80 years from the anniversary, they say none of the Rangers are there on the scene today. What can you tell us? We see President Biden making his way to the podium.
That's right. This is a speech being given at Pointe du Hoc, which is between Omaha and Utah beaches on the sheer cliffs of Normandy. Let's take a listen, Gail.
Please welcome the 46th President of the United States of America, Joe Biden.
John, how are you? Please sit down. At last, the hour had come. Dawn, 6th of June, 1944. The wind was pounding as it is today, and always has against these cliffs. 225 American Rangers arrived by ship, jumped into the waves and stormed the beach. All they could see was the outline of the shore and the enormity of these cliffs. And I'd like to look, I know I'll get in trouble with the Secret Service if I go to the edge and look over, but think of those cliffs as my host just showed me. That's what we're standing on top of. They could hear, all they could hear was the crack of bullets hitting ships, sand, rocks, hitting everything. All they knew was time was of the essence. They had only 30 minutes to eliminate the Nazi guns high on this cliff. Guns that could halt the Allied invasion before it even began. But these were American Rangers. They were ready. They ran toward the cliffs and mines planted on the beach by Field Marshal Rommel exploded around them, but still they kept coming. Gunfire rained above them, but still they kept coming. Nazi grenades thrown from above exploded against the cliffs, but still they kept coming. Within minutes, they reached the base of this cliff. They launched their ladders, their ropes, and grappling hooks, and they began to climb. When the Nazis cut their ladders, the Rangers used the ropes. When the Nazis cut their ropes, the Rangers used their hands. And inch by inch, foot by foot, yard by yard, the Rangers literally clawed their way up this mighty precipice until at last they reached the top. They breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and they turned in that one effort the tide of the war that began to save the world. Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday I paid my respects at the American Cemetery just a few miles from here, where many of those Rangers who died taking this cliff are buried. I spoke of what the fallen had done to defend freedom. Today, as I look out at this battlefield and all the bunkers and bomb craters that are still surrounded, one thought comes to mind. My God, how did they do it? How were these Americans willing to risk everything, dare everything, and give everything? There were Americans like Sergeant Leonard Lommel from New Jersey. He was one of the first Rangers to jump off his ship and run toward the cliff. He almost was shot right above the hip initially, and he wasn't sure, but he was. He kept going. At one point, he was scaling the cliff, and another Ranger yelled, "I'm not sure I can make it." And Lommel yelled back with every ounce of strength he had in him, "You've got to hold on." And he did, and they did. Americans like Sergeant Tom Ruggiero from Massachusetts. A German shell hit his boat as he was approaching the shore. Everything exploded. The sergeant was knocked into the freezing water. And as he told it, he began to utter a prayer. "Dear God, don't let me drown. I want to get in and do what I'm here and supposed to do." Americans like Colonel James Rudder, Texas. When the military asked for a battalion for this daring mission, he raised his hand and said, "My Rangers can do the job." He knew their capacity. He knew the strength of their character. A few days after they scaled this cliff, he wrote a condolence letter to a mother of one of the Rangers who gave his life here. And that letter said, "A country must be great to call for the sacrifice of such men. A country must be great to call for the sacrifice of such men." And Americans like John Wardell from New Jersey. John is here. John, we love you, man. Thank you for all you've done. Deserve that and a lot more, John. Just 18 years old, he deployed to this cliff to replace the surviving Rangers on that D-Day invasion. He would go on to fight across France and Germany. In early December 1944, during one of those battles, shrapnel pierced his skull. But by Christmas, he was back, fighting with his unit. And here's what he said about the notes he kept at that time. He said, "Knowing that my buddies and I always looked out for one another. That's why he came back. That's why he fought so hard to get back. He always looked out, and his buddies looked out for one another." We talk about democracy, American democracy. We often talk about the ideals of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. What we don't talk about is how hard it is, how many ways we're asked to walk away, how many instincts are to walk away. The most natural instinct is to walk away, to be selfish, to force our will upon others, to seize power, never give up. American democracy asks the hardest of things, to believe that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. So democracy begins with each of us. It begins when one person decides there's something more important than themselves. When they decide the person they're serving alongside of is someone to look after. When they decide the mission matters more than their life. When they decide that their country matters more than they do. That's what the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc did. That's what they decided. That's what every soldier, every Marine who stormed this beaches decided. A feared dictator had conquered a continent, had finally met his match. Because of them, the war turned. They stood against Hitler's aggression. Does anyone doubt that they would want America to stand up against Putin's aggression here in Europe today? They stormed the beaches alongside our allies. Does anyone believe these Rangers would want America to go it alone today? They fought to vanquish a hateful ideology in the 30s and 40s. Does anyone doubt they wouldn't move heaven and earth to vanquish hateful ideologies of today? These Rangers put mission and country above themselves. Does anyone believe they would exact any less from every American today? These Rangers remembered with reverence those who gave their lives in battle. Could they or anyone ever imagine that America would do the same, wouldn't do the same. They believed America was a beacon to the world. I'm certain they believed that it would be that way forever. You know, we stand today, where we stand was not sacred ground on June the 5th. But that's what it became on June the 6th. The Rangers who scaled this cliff didn't know they would change the world, but they did. I've long said that history has shown that ordinary Americans can do extraordinary things when challenged. There's no better example of that in the entire world than right here at Pointe du Hoc. Rangers from farms and cities in every part of America, from homes that didn't know wealth and power. They came to a shoreline that none of them would have picked out on a map. They came to a country many of them had never seen, for a people they had never met. But they came. They did their job. They fulfilled their mission. And they did their duty. They were part of something greater than themselves. They were Americans. I stand here today as the first president to come to Pointe du Hoc when none of those 225 brave men who scaled this cliff on D-Day are still alive. None. But I'm here to tell you that with them gone, the wind we hear coming off this ocean will not fade. It will grow louder as we gather here today. It's not just to honor those who showed such remarkable bravery on that day, June 6, 1944. It's to listen to the echoes of their voices, to hear them, because they are summoning us, and they're summoning us now. They ask us, what will we do? They're not asking us to scale these cliffs, but they're asking us to stay true to what America stands for. They're not asking us to give or risk our lives, but they are asking us to care for others in our country more than ourselves. They're not asking us to do their job. They're asking us to do our job, to protect freedom in our time, to defend democracy, to stand up aggression abroad and at home, to be part of something bigger than ourselves. My fellow Americans, I refuse to believe, I simply refuse to believe that America's greatness is a thing of the past. I still believe there's nothing beyond our capacity in America when we act together. We're the fortunate heirs of a legacy of these heroes, those who scale the cliffs, Pointe du Hoc. But we must also be the keepers of their mission, the keepers of their mission, the bearers of the flame of freedom that they kept burning bright. That is the truest testimonial to their lives. Our actions every day to ensure that our democracy endures and the soul of our nation endures. To come here simply to remember the ghosts of Pointe du Hoc isn't enough. We need to hear them. We have to listen to them. We need to listen to what they had. We need to make a solemn vow to never let them down. God bless the fallen. God bless the brave men who scaled these cliffs. May God protect our troops. God bless America.
Let's bring back Ed O'Keefe who is at Pointe du Hoc. Ed, I think the president painted quite a picture as he took us through that day. You could almost see it, you could feel it, you could hear it, in the pride in which he delivered those remarks, and then he made the pivot to democracy. What was your takeaway as you listened to what he had to say?
Well, first, let's tell you a little more about Private John Wardle there. He's from New Jersey, turning 99 next month. Came ashore on June 16th, 1944, so D-Day plus 10 at the age of 18, and a member of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. Served with Rangers in the Battle of Brest and eventually was wounded in Germany. and is the only World War II era veteran in attendance today. As you heard the president say, the 225 Army Rangers who scaled this 100-foot cliff are no longer with us. At the end of that mission, of the 225, there were only about 70 to 90 left able to continue in battle, Gail, a sign of just the sheer sacrifice and brutality of the attack. The president is walking out here. We're just keeping an eye on him as he goes to see if he wants to say anything. Mr. President, what do you think of today's?
Quite a stunning spot, is it not, sir? Have you ever seen anything like that?
Ask him anything like that. He says that he'd been here before, but he had never seen anything quite like this. And it is a beautiful day, Gail. Forgive us for listening to him there for a second. Sheer cliffs, again, 100-foot plus. A beautiful sunny day, a light breeze, not the weather that those that stormed these beaches back in 1944 had. The president wanted to come here today to honor that sacrifice, as Ronald Reagan had before him, as Bill Clinton did as well, to call attention to the fact that he's concerned about, and many other Americans are concerned about, the future of democracy in the United States and around the world. So he's, in essence, trying to summon Americans to remember the sacrifice that happened here and keep that in mind as the nation goes to the election in the coming months.
You know what, Ed? You know what struck me listening to him? I actually got goosebumps listening to the picture that he painted, because for so many people, what he described is like a movie. But this was not a movie. When he said ordinary Americans can do extraordinary things when challenged, he's urging all Americans to stay true to what Americans stand for. Honestly, it gave me goosebumps to listen to the words that he said and what it truly means when we think about what's at stake here.
And, you know, if yesterday's message was designed to criticize and attack what Russia's doing to Ukraine, what the White House had said is they wanted Americans especially to hear what he was saying here today in France. Obviously, the rest of the world hears it as well, but there was a real desire by the president to speak more directly to people back home about his concerns about the future of democracy versus autocracy. We'll see if he did it. But he did it on a beautiful day and continues back to Paris for meetings that continue through the weekend here.
Yes, he did. And a reminder, too, that many of these people, these young men, they were 18, 19, 20 years old. It's staggering to me. Face the Nation moderator and chief foreign affairs correspondent, that's Margaret Brennan, joins us now. She's in Washington. Margaret, we know that the president sat down with President Zelensky just this morning. What can you tell us about what came out of that meeting?
Well, Gail, you heard the president just there connect the dots between what is happening in Europe now, which is in the midst of the largest land war it has experienced since World War II, in Ukraine. President Biden saying those Americans who stormed that beach came on to Omaha Beach. We owe it to them and their sacrifice to, again, defend the democracy, he said, in Ukraine. He said those soldiers today would be standing up to Vladimir Putin. Today in that meeting, President Biden apologized to the president of Ukraine for the very first time in public, saying, we're sorry that it took so long for the United States to approve this latest round of aid. $61 billion American taxpayers have pledged to Ukraine in an emergency bill, 225 handed over today in the form of artillery, other weaponry, personnel carriers, so that Ukraine can turn the tide, Gail, because in that 6-month delay President Biden referred to, Ukraine is a bit on the back foot as it tries to defend towns along the eastern side of the country in the face of that Russian aggression. And, Gail, I'm sure you saw that touching moment yesterday between a World War II vet and President Zelensky himself, saying, you're the hero of the people. President Zelensky said, no, you saved Europe. So it's not just President Biden drawing those connections between the dangerous moment we're in now and what happened back in 1944.
I did see that moment, Margaret, and there is so much at stake. Thank you so much. Our coverage of the D-Day anniversary will continue on CBS News 24/7 on your local news, and, of course, tonight on the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell. Many of you now will return to CBS Mornings, but you should know this has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Gail King, CBS News here in New York.
You were just watching a CBS News special report covering President Biden's remarks in Normandy, France. The president is commemorating 80 years since the D-Day invasion of Normandy. His address just now focused on the legacy of Pointe du Hoc as well as threats to global democracy. So let's bring back CBS News' reporter Olivia Gazis and CBS News correspondent Elaine Cobb. Olivia, what stood out to you from what we just heard from the president from a national security perspective?
Vlad, what was striking to me was that this speech sounded much more like a call to action by the president than it was an assertion of the strength and unity of the world's democracies. He has used these speeches overseas before to stress that the world remains united in the face of aggression by autocrats worldwide. When he was in Warsaw to mark the one-year anniversary of the conflict in Ukraine, he was able to say, he had a similarly lofty speech, and he was able to say democracies have grown stronger, not weaker, and autocracies have grown weaker, not stronger. He's not in a position to say that right now because the tests to democracy are real and the flux is real. Half of the world is going to the polls this year in what could result in major political changes in the U.S., in Europe, and in Asia. And so when he said today, when he is posing these rhetorical questions, what would these heroes want you to do? He was stressing the stakes of making a different choice than the one that the world has made thus far, which is to stand by and protect democratic norms.
Let's bring in Ed O'Keefe, Ed, and I just wanted you to sort of springboard off of what Olivia just said and kind of get your take on his remarks here and how they compare to what we heard from him yesterday, the other remarks. I mean, it appears he is staying on message. I mean, this is something that he really wants to hammer home to the global audience.
Yeah, look, that was a remarkably short speech in such a dramatic spot here on such a beautiful day. But remember, it's part of a 5-day trip, the first 3 of which were essentially devoted to memorializing D-Day and what happened 80 years ago starting this week. And so while yesterday was a global event where the world is invited to remember at the American Cemetery and the International Cemetery with kings and queens and prime ministers, and they addressed the world, today he really wanted to ensure that Americans perhaps were reminded at the height of such stark division in the midst of a high-stakes campaign year, that the sacrifice that was made here by the 225 Army Rangers that scaled this cliff to take out these German artillery, to allow the invasion to continue, is one worth remembering and living up to in whatever it is Americans decide to do. His point about ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things to save the world and to sustain American power. And so that's, in essence, what he did. Does it draw implicit contrasts with Donald Trump back home? To some extent, it sure does. Does it put him back on the world stage and remind Americans back home that he's the kind of president that can come to this part of the world or any other and summon other leaders and reinforce American support? Yes. And that is also what they wanted to accomplish today. So he did it. Will it be fairly or unfairly compared to what Ronald Reagan did 40 years ago? It probably will. Was it as succinctly delivered? Probably not. But it also was, designed to send a message to people back home, as I said, during this rough year.
All right, Ed O'Keefe for us at Pointe du Hoc in France. Ed, thank you very, very much for your perspective and your reporting. Let's bring in the host and moderator of CBS News' Face the Nation, Margaret Brennan. Margaret, it's good to see you. So I want to draw our viewers' attention to something that you tweeted a short time ago about President Biden and his perspective and the speech that he just delivered, that he was just a small child on D-Day, June 6, 1944. But today, 81-year-old Biden, I'm quoting you now, Margaret, stands there as the commander-in-chief and compares it to this moment in time and says, those Army Rangers would again today seek to vanquish hateful ideologies. Unpack that for us.
Well, that's exactly right, Vlad. And that is one of the contrasts here when you think about it, that at 81 years old, President Biden was alive on D-Day as that war was being waged, and as Allied forces turned the tide there, he can relate in some ways to that moment in time where it felt like America was helping to save the world from hateful ideology. And he compared that, said those Army Rangers that stormed those beaches that day, he believes would today stand up to another hateful ideology, an implicit reference to some of the isolationist trends, not just here in the United States, but as you know, Vlad, there are right-wing parties in Europe who are ascendant right now as well, in France and other countries. Also referring back to Vladimir Putin as the tyrant of the moment and saying those Army Rangers, if alive today, would be standing up to him once again as the largest land war in Europe since World War II wages in Ukraine, a war we should note U.S. forces are not part of right now, but are helping to arm and defend Ukraine. And Vlad, it is so immediate for those in Europe who feel the proximity to that fight and the shock of Vladimir Putin going in and attacking a European capital, Kyiv, nearly 3 years ago now. And so this feels very close to home for many in Europe. And France, host to these festivities today and this remembrance, their president has talked about needing to keep the option of potentially sending troops on the table. So in the mind of President Biden and others there, this conflict has a lot of echoes of another very dangerous period of time when the forces of isolationism, when the forces of hate were ascendant in Europe.
And, you know, during World War II, there were Americans there that were resistant to Americans' involvement in World War II, right? There was an America First committee that was resistant to that. And so it brings me to the apology that we heard from the president to Volodymyr Zelensky today. But he also apology for the delay in military aid. And he also sort of put the blame squarely in the laps of Congress. And so I wonder how much of the messaging that we've heard since he's been in France is also for the audience at home. And we can't sort of kind of deny the fact that Donald Trump is back on the campaign trail. And I'm sure the president is aware of that, too.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, it occurs to me that another individual who was alive when those beaches were stormed was the Republican leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, who has been standing up to those forces of isolationism within his party and actually told us back in April. I spoke to him right after he hung up with Volodymyr Zelensky and apologized on behalf of the Republican Party for that 6-month delay in the United States approving the aid package to surge weapons, 225 of which today were 225 million of that $61 billion package released to Ukraine today by President Biden. In it, artillery, personnel vehicles, other items, as Ukraine tries to close the gap. That delay had real-world impact on the battlefield. Even Mitch McConnell says the Republican Party, his party, had some responsibility for that because the United States, as Reagan and others would say, is the arsenal of democracy. It is the largest weapons producer in the world. It can turn it around faster, and delivering those, the failure to deliver, did have an impact. Russian forces have reconstituted. Ukraine is, in some ways, on the back foot in the east of the country. That is why last week President Biden changed policy and said that Ukraine can use U.S. weapons to fire into the Russian Federation for the first time, something the United States have been reluctant to do because they didn't want that to be perceived as an escalation, telling Ukraine at first you can only use weapons in a defensive manner, not offensive. Now, the United States saying, we understand you're getting hit hard and you can hit back at what's being fired at you from that Belgorod region, right across from Kharkiv, that area they're trying to defend right now. So this is a key moment on the battlefield, key moment in American democracy, but also around the world as we look at some of these right-wing movements, nationalist, isolationist movements who are ascendant in many places. And so President Biden likes to refer to that and frame his worldview as about democracy versus autocracy, whether it's Vladimir Putin, whether it's Xi Jinping, or other forces at home that are anti-migrant, that are racist, and other things that are, as you know, a part of the troubling and painful part of our political sphere right now.
All right, Margaret Brennan, thank you very, very much for your perspective and analysis as always. We thank you very much.
I think Elaine Cobb's just standing by for us. Elaine, so just sort of wrap things up for us. I don't know what, if anything, is left on the agenda for the president, but can you tell us what's to come?
Well, the president will have his official state visit to France tomorrow. He'll be back in Paris. And, of course, a major part of it will be a one-on-one meeting with President Emmanuel Macron at the Elysee Palace, where they're expected to discuss wide-ranging issues. Ukraine, of course, very high up on that list, but also the situation in Gaza and commercial links between France and the US and between the US and Europe, because President Macron likes to be a spokesman for Europe on many occasions. There will then be an official state dinner at the Elysee Palace as well. It's a day of meetings. He's also going to meet with members of the American business community here to discuss commercial links, to discuss how the US is doing in Europe and how to build on those commercial links and to increase business here. So very much a busy schedule tomorrow here in Paris for what is being called the official state visit beyond the Normandy celebrations and commemorations.
All right, Elaine, Olivia, thank you so much. All right, so the prosecution just rested in its case in Hunter Biden's federal gun trial after two more witnesses, a drug expert and an FBI chemist, took the stand this morning. Yesterday, the jury heard from a key witness, Hallie Biden, his brother Beau's widow. She had a relationship with Hunter after Beau died in 2015, and she testified about Hunter's drug use and also recounted